I had a student ask me a question one time in a class, and this was sometime around mid-October 1997, and I'd been lecturing on the War of 1812, and as I was about to talk about the Battle of New Orleans, and the Battle of New Orleans is this wonderful episode because Andrew Jackson, he assembles this heterogeneous cosmopolitan army. It's got regular U.S. forces. Then he's got militia from Louisiana, and they are either of French or Spanish descent, and they don't particularly like one another. And then there are Kentucky and Tennessee frontiersmen. They don't like one another. And then he also had 52 Choctaw Indians. And of course, the Choctaw Indians are always forgotten. But then he had free men of color, and there were about 600 of these free men of color that he had. And then he also had some slaves that helped in the. So by assembling this force, you know, I'm trying to weave a narrative in class and explain to these students why this battle is so important. And the student raises his hand and says, well, Dr. Smith, you told us in the last class period that when the British were operating in the Chesapeake Bay in 1813, 1814, that slaves there were being liberated and many of them were joining with the British. And now you're telling us that slaves are joining with Andrew Jackson at New Orleans. So which one is right? Well, that was a question I couldn't answer. And, you know, I said, well, I'll get back to you and I'll answer next class period. Well, I pulled out all my stuff and tried to find an answer, and they just couldn't find an answer to it. So the next class period comes, and I just don't look him in the eye. I just refuse to acknowledge him for the rest of the term. And the problem is he was a good student, so he just kept prodding me on this. And it made me realize if I couldn't answer the question, then I needed to find an answer for it. So I spent, 15 years writing this book, and, researching it and writing it to offer an answer why slaves and free blacks chose to side with whomever they did during the War of 1812. And one of the things I can tell you is that, of course, the War of 1812 is a conflict between Great Britain on one hand and the United States on the other. The problem is slaves had more choices than simply Great Britain on one hand and the United States on the other. Ultimately, what I found as I was researching this book is that slaves had as many as 5 options of whom they would join. They would side with the Americans when it best suited them. They would join with Great Britain when it suited them. In the Gulf South, they would often side with the Spanish. And then they would often side with Native Americans and join Native American communities. And then there were instances where runaway slaves formed their own maroon communities. So ultimately, with those 5 choices, this was not a simple question for me to answer. It became very complicated. Yes, slaves do fight for the Americans, and a story I'll share with you there is the story of Jordan Noble. Jordan Noble was born in Augusta, Georgia, about 1800. He is the offspring of a European parent and a slave parent. At the time of the Battle of New Orleans, this is 1814, that Jackson begins mobilizing men for the defense of the city. Jordan Noble is going to be volunteered by his current owner to serve as a drummer boy. And the one thing I try to remind people about drummer boys is that it's more than just simply beating a beat. Every order that is given on a battlefield has a corresponding beat. And that is because in the heat of battle, when there's loud cannon fire and musket fire and there's smoke and you can't hardly hear or see, the beat of that drum would tell men what to do. And so he serves as a drummer boy. Now, at the time of the Battle of New Orleans, he is serving, and the climactic engagement happens on January 8th, 1815, and it's one of the more dramatic episodes in American history. I've often argued it's really what we call the first American victory. Well, during that battle, Jordan Noble is right near Jackson the whole time because he has to beat out the orders. And once the battle is over, Jordan Noble and the other soldiers are going to be dismissed. Jordan Noble, he's, a 15-year-old boy at this point in time. He goes back to being a slave, and ultimately he will secure his freedom, but by the 1820s, he's going to be volunteering for American service again, this time fighting in the Seminole War that'll begin in the early 1830s and go through the early 1840s. He will fight in a third war, and that will be the Mexican War. In fact, he would be one of the very few African Americans who will see service in the Mexican War. And then in 1861, he's going, when the southern states secede from the Union, he will raise a regiment of troops for the Confederacy. So he'll have service in 4 wars. Now, the problem with him raising troops for the Confederacy is that this action is often used by neo-Confederates, modern Confederates, to say that blacks served in the Confederacy. Well, this is simply not the case, because when the Union Navy takes New Orleans in the spring of 1862, very early in the war, the Union Army will occupy New Orleans, and those black Confederates will then volunteer their services for the Union Army. And they will actually see service in the Union Army where they did not see service in the Confederate Army. In fact, Jordan Noble will help raise a regiment for the Louisiana Native Guards, which is the famous black unit there in New Orleans. Well, this guy, Jordan Noble, he has a long life. He dies in the summer of 1890. He's seen service in 4 wars. He'd hold distinction as being a veteran of 4 wars. He's the person that is most notably acknowledged as a black participant for the Americans in the War of 1812. I'll tell you the story about a slave named Charles Ball. He was from Calvert County, Maryland. Now, about 1807, his owner sold him south to Georgia. And Charles Ball claimed that when he got there, he was able to escape from Georgia. He traveled only at night. He lived off of the land. And it took him about a year and a half to get back to Calvert County, Maryland. And my first question was, why in the heck would you go back there if your owner sold you from there? By the time he got back, his owner was dead. And he went back because he had family there. He had a wife and kids. Well, when he gets back, his owner's dead. He begins hiring himself out as a free laborer. And the people in the neighborhood know he's a former slave, but they hire him anyway. And by the time of the War of 1812, he is acknowledged as being a respectable worker there in the neighborhood. Well, in the spring of 1813, after the British had raided through the neighborhood, a group of white plantation owners traveled to the British fleet to meet with the British commanders and try to convince their slaves to return. They take Charles Ball with him. And they get there and they plead with the slaves that are in British possession now, and the slaves simply refuse to go. They convinced Charles Ball to spend a night with the slaves and to mingle about them and to convince some to return to their former condition. At the end of the night, the next day, still no slaves choose to go back. They're going to remain free under the British. And as Charles Ball is exiting the ship, a British officer asked him, "Would you like to join us as a free man in a British colony?" And Charles Ball looked at him and said, "No, I am a free man. I have all the land to work that I can." That's not exactly right. Charles Ball wasn't a free man. He was a fugitive slave. But yet he had crafted an identity, a story about himself that he was sticking to. Well, a little more than a year later, Charles Ball will choose to join the American Navy. He joins and fights as a part of Joshua Barney's gunboat flotilla in the Chesapeake. He will be part of the Marines that travel to Washington, D.C., and then they pull a field gun, a 6-pound field piece, they pull it out to Bladensburg. And the sailors and Marines, they'll put the guns on the high point to the west of the bridge crossing the eastern Anacostia. And when the British cross that bridge, it's those cannon that are constantly enfilading British lines. And it's those cannon and those sailors and Marines that provide the only real defense at Bladensburg. The sailors and Marines continue fighting until Joshua Barney is injured. He's wounded. And he orders his men to spike the guns and to retreat. Charles Ball was a sponger on a cannon. Well, he simply drops his sponge, and instead of retreating west with most of them, he walks directly into British lines because he's a black man. And the British had been evacuating refugee slaves. And instead of walking through the British lines and joining with the British, he works his way to Baltimore, where he will participate in the defense of Baltimore a few weeks later as the British try to take Baltimore. And after the War of 1812, Charles Ball goes back to Calvert County, becomes a farmer. And he and his wife, they buy property. His first wife dies, he marries a second. And then about 1830, disaster strikes. A slave trader coming through the neighborhood claims to recognize him from about 20 years before. Claims that he is a slave that he had sold south to Georgia. So Charles Ball would be put in chains and dragged back to Georgia. Well, he would escape again. And this time it takes him about a year to get his way back to Calvert County. And by the time he got back, his wife and his kids had been rounded up by slave traders, and they had been whisked off to the south as slaves. Charles Ball wrote an autobiographical account. That's how we know so much about him. And there's some question about the real validity of it. There seems to be parts that some people claim are too fanciful to be real. But what Charles Ball said is that once his wife and kids were taken, he published this book to make money, and he spent all the money he had. He sold all of his property to try to find his wife and his kids. And we don't ever know if he really did. But what we do know is that had Charles Ball given a different answer to those British officers aboard that ship, had that British officer, when he said, "Do you want to join us as a free citizen in a British colony?" Had Charles Ball said, "Sure, let me go get the wife and the little wife and the kids, and we'll be right back." But instead he said no. He had fabricated an identity for himself, and that identity came back to haunt him. Another story that plays a prominent role in my book is the story of a slave named Ned Simmons. Ned Simmons is the slave of the famed American Revolutionary hero, Nathanael Greene. Now, Nathanael Greene is one of the great heroes of the American Revolution, and after the Revolution, he would be rewarded for his service by being given land, and that land happened to be in Georgia. He would have possession of a plantation on Cumberland Island, which is near the present-day Georgia-Florida line. Now, one of the interesting things about Greene's career is that throughout the war, there by his side, he had his slave, Ned Simmons. Ned Simmons was born about 1760 or so, maybe 1763. We're quite unsure about that. And it was reported that Ned Simmons was an outstanding soldier. He knew how to handle a weapon, but even more so, he could play the fife. And reportedly played the fife on several occasions in Washington's tent to entertain the general. Other than that, Ned Simmons, his life is more or less determined by the rising and the setting of the sun. And the War of 1812 finally comes to the South Atlantic in January 1815. And the admiral in charge of the operation in the South Atlantic is a guy named Admiral George Cockburn. Cockburn is the admiral who had been in charge of the attack on Washington, D.C. And he's the one who had captured Washington and had much of the city burned. So when he commands in the south, he lands, the ships take possession of the waters around Cumberland Island. The Army, the Marines take Cumberland Island, and Cockburn actually makes Dungeness Plantation his headquarters. And all the sea islands there along the South Atlantic coast, the British are raiding those plantations. They're liberating slaves, and hundreds would find their way to Cumberland Island. Cumberland Island becomes a depot for slaves. And Ned Simmons, when given the opportunity, he would immediately volunteer to become a British colonial marine. And in fact, in his training as a British colonial marine, he is apparently so adept at handling a musket and, doing maneuvers and drills that even Admiral Cockburn comments on him, that this guy, Ned Simmons, although he is about 60 years old, he is a fine, outstanding soldier. But because he is older, Cockburn said, we'll keep Ned Simmons here on Cumberland Island. He'll serve as an example to all other slaves who make their way here to the island. And he'll show them what they too can become. So Ned Simmons is given a red uniform, he's given a musket, and he serves as an example. And for a period of about 2 months, there are more than 1,500 slaves that will work their way through Cumberland Island. And there is Ned Simmons holding his musket, being a fine, outstanding soldier. Well, by the first week in March, all of a sudden news of the end of the war had finally reached America. And there are American diplomats who end up coming to Cumberland Island to talk with Admiral Cockburn. And they are telling him that the war is over. You have to return all seized property, including slaves. Well, Cockburn is going to stall for about a week. And during that week, the British are evacuating as many slaves as they can. And ultimately, when he finally does decide to turn the island back over and to return the goods, he returns about 80 slaves. One of them is Ned Simmons, because he was there on the island. The Green family would eventually sell the plantation to another owner, and Ned Simmons is part of the property that was transferred. But Ned Simmons would eventually get his freedom. He does. When? 1863. It's estimated, in fact, Ned Simmons claims himself, he claims that he was a centenarian, 100 years old. And in 1863, when federal forces took control over Fernandina, Ned Simmons and his 70-year-old daughter, they fled under cover of darkness to make their way to Union lines. And how we know all this about Ned Simmons? Well, part of it was because Ned Simmons talked about being the slave of Nathanael Greene, and he had met George Washington on numerous occasions. And there was a newspaper reporter there. And this newspaper reporter did about a half dozen interviews with Ned Simmons. And he recorded all this information that Simmons talked about his life and how he had eventually gotten his freedom by fleeing to Union lines at the time of the American Civil War. The last interview that the newspaper reporter did, he claimed that Ned Simmons said that if I were to die today, I could go to the Lord knowing I'm a free man. He died about 2 weeks later. So he did become a free man, and that was one of the last things he did. Well, I think the understanding from this book and from the story of black participation in the War of 1812 is that blacks would participate on every side of the conflict, whether it be with Spaniards or Britons or with Americans, whether it be in the Army or the Navy, or whether it be with Native Americans or runaway Maroon communities. They're willing to use any avenue that they can if they think it can bring them freedom. Now, what happens, however, once the war is over, the plight of African Americans is going to worsen considerably. In fact, in Maryland and Virginia, that had been so devastated by the war, politicians and lawmakers there will instantly begin tightening up the restrictions on slavery, forbidding free blacks to remain in the state, forbidding the arming of slaves in any manner whatsoever. And in fact, in 1831, when Virginia revised its constitution, there were attempts to kind of eliminate slavery, and those attempts were beaten back by those who said we have to tighten slavery rather than to loosen it. Well, all across the South, you'll see that same thing happening, whether it be in North and South Carolina or Georgia. And then the War of 1812 opened up an entirely new frontier along the Gulf South. You know, Mississippi will become a state in 1817. Louisiana becomes a state in 1812. Alabama becomes a state in 1819. And this opens up fresh farming lands, especially for Southern cotton, plantation agriculture cotton. So what happens is that the war creates new impetus for growth and expansion of slavery across the South. And while I had hoped, as I initially began this book, that this book would become a freedom story that would have a happy ending, it ultimately became a freedom story that had a sad ending. And although I'm an American, I've written about the War of 1812 for 2+ decades. The hero in my mind that came out of this book was the British. You know, the British liberated slaves, and they evacuated them to places like Bermuda and Trinidad and Jamaica and Belize and Halifax. So I think that's the story of all of these people. You know, the ones who fled, they wanted to do something they were proud of. They wanted to have freedom. They wanted to have choices. And the ones who fled, initially their choices weren't so good, but it was their choice nonetheless. Those who remained, they had no choice at all.